The gunshots echoed deafeningly in the rally that was filled with people speaking excitedly, soaking in every word that their leader was saying. But who was this leader, and most importantly, who was trying to kill him and why? That man was Gamal Abdel Nasser. Gamal Abdel Nasser was born in Egypt on January 15, 1918. His father was Apostle Waka. Later he went to reside with his uncle as he studied in elementary school, only to move later in 1928 to live with his maternal grandfather. A charismatic fellow from birth, he was constantly in trouble with school teachers. He participated in anti-British street demonstrations, and one left him with a lifelong scar on his forehead. Nasser applied for Egyptian army officer training at the Royal Military Academy in 1937. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the army after graduating from the academy. He met his sweetheart Tahir Kazan and married her in 1938. On July 23, 1952, Gamal Abdel Nasser and other military men staged a coup and ousted the ruling monarchy. These officers called themselves the Free Officers. Egypt was then taken over by a council of 11 officers with a Major General Mohammed Naguib as the head of state. However, Nasser removed Mohammed from power and named himself Prime Minister. On June 23, 1956, 99% of Egyptian voters elected Gamal Abdel Nasser as the first president of the Republic of Egypt. Abdel Nasser passionately and fearlessly supported Algeria's National Liberation Front when it launched a war for independence from greedy and bloodthirsty France. His strong support for the Algerian cause prompted André Biofre, commander of the French forces, to say, France would have fewer problems if Nasser was removed. To the French, Abdel Nasser was a thorn on their greedy flesh, especially when Nasser decided to nationalize the Suez Canal. More on that later. But yes, indeed, his support for Algerian independence saw Nasser directing as many arms and supplies as possible be given to National Liberation Front by any means necessary, if possible, even through airlifts. Algerians even received military training in Egypt. Other forms of weapon delivery came through the sea. While there was a fast Aswan Dam that helped much in irrigation, Abdel Nasser sought funds to build a bigger dam that would be key for Egypt's economic development. The first dam was unable to hold back the annual flooding of Nile River. Therefore, in the 1950s, Nasser envisioned building the new dam that would bring electric power to every corner of Egypt. Initially, the UK, the US, and the World Bank offered financial support, but those plans were put off when those nations learned of a secret Egyptian arms agreement with the USSR. Nasser had no option but to turn to the Soviet Union, who were more than happy to give him a loan that was much bigger than what the US had proposed. Heavy machinery was sent in from the USSR to move the enormous amounts of stone and clay that were needed. On July 21, 1970, the ambitious project was completed, and on January 15, 1971, at a ribbon-cutting ceremony to officially open the dam, the flags of both Egypt and the Soviet Union were proudly flown. However, one of the downsides of construction of the dam is that many of the Nubian civilization archaeological sites were lost to the reservoir, which would eventually become a new lake. Nasser took a bold stance in 1956 by nationalizing the Suez Canal.
From Alexandria, Egypt, Mobitone News brings you the latest incident to upset the chancelleries of the free world. President Nasser delivering his fiery speech telling of his nationalization of the Suez Canal. A seizure from private interests that the Egyptian says is his answer to the West for refusing to finance the Aswan Dam. It's a situation fraught with implications. But undeterred, President Nasser raises his country's flag to symbolize his action. And although his followers hail him and carry him triumphantly on their shoulders, in London, Paris, and Washington, the fate of the strategic waterway causes grave concern.
He found it unacceptable that the Suez Canal was not owned by Egypt. Despite the Suez Canal being located in Egypt, it was owned and controlled by the British and the French for almost 9 decades of its existence. It was operated by a multinational firm headquartered in Paris, in which the British government held 44% of shares. His announcement electrified the Egyptian people, the Arab region, and the entire Third World. Nasser wanted to use the fees of the Suez Canal to pay for the building of the bigger Aswan Dam. In response, Israel invaded in late October, and British and French forces landed in early November, occupying the canal zone. Luckily, there was lots of pressure from the Soviets, the United States, and the United Nations. Britain and France withdrew in December, and Israeli forces left in March 1957. That very month, Egypt took control of the canal and reopened it to commercial shipping. In September, Nasser announced an arms deal with Czechoslovakia, the first weapons sale by any non-Western power to an Arab country. Part of Nasser's goals was to build a strong, national army. Added to that was the fact that the Israeli military had carried out an operation in Gaza, which was under Egyptian control, on February 28, 1955. This operation targeted the Egyptian army and 38 Egyptian soldiers ended up dead. Nasser then reached out to the US since he wanted to purchase heavy weapons, but the United States only offered light weapons, and it did so under 2 conditions. 1. The weapons were to be fully paid in cash, and 2. The weapons were only to be used for internal security and defense. Nasser let it be known in 1954-55 that he was considering buying weapons from the Soviet Union. This was his way of pressuring the Americans into selling him the weapons he wanted. The Soviet Union was more than willing to arm Egypt if the Americans proved unwilling. And so, in June 1955, the deal was done. In this most interesting deal, Egypt was to receive 100 T-34 tanks, Astollin tanks, 80 jet fighter planes, 30 bombers, large quantities of self-propelled guns, armored personnel carriers, artillery equipment, several naval vessels, small arms, and munitions. The news was greeted with shock and rage in the West, where this was seen as a major increase in Soviet influence in the Near East. The deal achieved and surpassed Nasser's main goal, which was to be able to effectively defend Egypt's borders. During his time as the leader of Egypt, Nasser improved the rights of women, and women were finally allowed to vote in 1956. A Muslim Brotherhood member tried to assassinate Nasser in 1954, firing 8 shots at the platform where he was speaking. Nasser was at Manshia Square in the city of Alexandria to celebrate the signing of a new treaty with Britain, a treaty that would usher in a new era of independence and national sovereignty for his country. Nasser was prime minister then, and fortunately, he was uninjured. However, several on the stage near him were slightly hurt by flying glass. A 22-year-old man from Cairo had fired the shots. Immediately, the Muslim Brotherhood was banned, and over 1,000 of its members were arrested. A small number of these were executed. The Brotherhood was portrayed as a conspiratorial group working against the interests of Nasser and his government. Nasser will forever be remembered as an African leader who stood against anti-colonial foreign policy, and a leader who wanted true freedom and dignity for his people.